Pope Francis is dead. After an eventful 12 years at the head of the Catholic Church, he died on Monday. We'll take a unique Bible-based look at his legacy, as well as where the next pope is likely to be quite different on today's Trumpet World. Pope Francis has easily been the most controversial pope in modern history. And most of the look-backs that you're getting now at his life focus on some of these doctrinal controversies, particularly his stance on things like homosexuality, his alleged wokeness. He is kind of accused of being the woke pope. His stance on migrants is another area that you'll see a lot of focus on. And some of these are areas that you can expect a future pope to reverse and row back on. They won't be a real lasting legacy of Pope Francis. But there are some real lasting changes of significance brought about by Pope Francis's time in office. He did increase the profile of the Roman Catholic Church in many ways. Within 8 months of becoming pope, he was arguably the most popular and loved man on earth. He was the hope of millions and the Time magazine's Person of the Year. The enthusiasm that he brought to the Catholic Church, particularly during the first half of his time in office, gained the name the Francis Effect. And on December 11th, 2023, when Time nominated him as their Man of the Year, they wrote, "What makes this pope so important is the speed with which he has captured the imaginations of millions who have given up on hoping for the church at all." Now, in an era that is starting to turn on woke, at least in some quarters, I think some of that luster has rubbed off the pope in recent years. But with the aid of Bible prophecy, we can see what will last and what are the most significant changes that he brought about. And there certainly will be some reverses from what Pope Francis has done and stances that he has taken. But he moved Bible prophecy forward in some very significant ways. The first of these that I want to look at is he rallied the world against the US-dominated financial system. The very first big encyclical that he wrote, published in November 2013, was called Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel. And this was a response to the global financial crisis that got started in 2008. It does cover a whole range of subjects, but the most striking theme of it is its attack on the global financial system, particularly capitalism. Attack that in some ways is justified. The global financial system that we have right now is not God's system, and in other ways not, and in other ways bringing in some error and untruths of its own. Pope Francis attacked unfettered capitalism as a new tyranny. He condemned income inequality. He attacked the, quote, culture of prosperity, and condemned it as a financial system which rules rather than serves. This was set up as a defense of the poor, but it really was a denunciation of capitalism, and in particular, the US-led global financial system. Reuters said that the Pope here was demanding an overhaul of the financial system. He even called this kind of US-led free market economic system the dung of the devil. And I want to get into how all of these lasting pieces of legacy from Pope Francis tie into Bible prophecy towards the end of this section. But I'll note that in 1984, Herbert W. Armstrong talked about a massive banking crisis, and he said it could suddenly result in triggering European nations to unite as a new world power larger than either the Soviet Union or the US. And we saw that start to happen after the 2008 financial crisis, though there's still more to the story on that to come. And the Pope used that crisis to set out the case for a new financial system centered in Europe with Catholic control, to replace the US-led one. And that really is what his Joy of the Gospel encyclical was all about. And to combat the unfairness that he attacked, the inequality that is the dung of the devil, well, this would be a big state economic system. And then to make sure that the big state with high taxes and high social spending doesn't become a tyranny, well, it would of course be guided by the Catholic Church. And that's the case that he sets out. The next year, he published another encyclical, Laudato Si, or Be Praised. That was in June 2014, and this picked up many of the same themes, but then brought in a lot of environmental issues as well. So it brought on a new attack on the US-led financial system, But then also argued, as well as bringing about inequality and poverty, the US-led financial system is destroying the environment. And Pope Francis became well known as being outspoken on global warming and climate change. In that encyclical, he quoted Benedict XVI, who said that to manage all the economic crises around the world, to manage global arms races, war, climate change, Pope Benedict said, there is an urgent need for a true world political authority. And Pope Francis was echoing those words. He was calling for a new global government. Now, in all of this, he doesn't acknowledge that free market capitalism has been the most successful economic tool in man's history for lifting people out of poverty. And again, I'm not saying that this is perfect and that the US-led financial system is a detailed application of what is written in the Bible. But I am saying that there are some biblical principles there. And if we're going to bring about a Bible-led global economic system, we need to acknowledge that. And we need to see what it gets right accurately as well as what it gets wrong. But this really was the end game of and the purpose of those encyclicals. It was calling for a true world political authority led by the Catholic Church. That is what Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, and all these other popes ultimately have been pushing for. Going back to this encyclical, he talked about, well, given the flawed nature of the current Western economic system, he said, it is essential to devise stronger and more efficiently organized international institutions with functionaries who are appointed fairly by agreement among national governments and empowered to impose sanctions. We need people that are a layer of government that can put sanctions on national governments. You hear a lot about globalism these days. Pope Francis was kind of pushing globalism before it was cool. And all of this in these encyclicals was in a very overt anti-US, anti-British context. The attack on what he called unfettered capitalism, for example, was clearly directed at the United States. We have articles we can put in our show notes here. So clearly the Pope here is calling for a world political authority, and he's very much against Britain and America. He doesn't want them to have any great influence in this political authority. It would be led instead by the Catholic Church. And you don't have to delve too far into his own words to see that that's what he believed. A second significant way that Pope Francis moved Bible prophecy forward is that he continued the Vatican as a political power. Now, the Catholic Church has always engaged in politics. It's always, opposed certain leaders, worked to negotiate deals. I don't think you could ever say, well, the Catholic Church hasn't done that. So this wasn't a massive change that Pope Francis was bringing. But I still think his work here is noteworthy and worth reviewing. And we saw this very much on display in 2016, where he visited the US and Mexico in the context of an American presidential election. And this was while Donald Trump was campaigning to be elected for the first time. And Pope Francis went to the US border. He gave the first ever Catholic Mass at the border and had a lot to say about migration. He was asked about this, and the Pope said, a person who thinks about only building walls, wherever they may be, and not about building bridges, is not Christian. This is not the gospel, he continued. As far as what you said about whether I would advise to vote or not vote, I'm not going to get involved in that. I only say that this man is not Christian if he has said things like that. He knows exactly what Donald Trump had said about building walls. We're talking about a pope that has responded in recent weeks to what J.D. Vance wrote on Twitter. He is very closely following US politics. And he, as part of this trip, wanted to get out a message. He wanted to say, in the context of a US presidential election, Donald Trump is not a Christian. This guy who was running, think back to 2016, that was the big theme of President Trump's campaign. Build the wall. And Pope Francis says if somebody's running on a build the wall campaign, they are not Christian. Very involved in US politics. Now, migrants coming into the US tend to be Catholics. And so this favors the Catholic Church. This helps them to have greater influence in US politics. So the Pope is strongly in favor in that. Now you having more and more of millions of Muslim migrants coming into Europe. And I think this is an area where we can expect the next Pope's stance to change because of how the migration crisis is affecting Europe. He was being influenced by these US considerations. Now, to be fair to Pope Francis, he's been consistent on this and he's encouraged migration to Europe as well as to the United States. But watch for that to change. But going back to this overall point, in 2013, he said a good Catholic meddles in politics. He sees it as part of his religious duty. And we'll keep looking at more areas where he does this. But another legacy of Pope Francis's time in office is that he developed the Vatican as a peacemaker. He was a very political pope, and we see this in a lot of his peace deals. In December 2014, for example, President Barack Obama surprised the world when he announced that after 53 years of hostility, America would restore diplomatic ties with Cuba. And after that announcement, very quickly, we learned more and more about how involved the Catholic Church was in this deal. This was a deal that very much favored Cuba. They didn't have to abandon communism. They didn't have to reform their dictatorial government. In practical terms, the US got nothing out of the deal. And Pope Francis played the key role. He was appealing to both leaders by letter. You had cardinals coming into the White House by the back door doing shuttle diplomacy. The Vatican's involvement goes all the way back to Pope Benedict in 2012 when he began pressurizing the US to normalize relations with Cuba. And then the Biden presidency ended with Pope Francis again playing a similar role and receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom with distinction. President Biden signing a new Cuba deal, one that Donald Trump swiftly overturned, but they're still trying to do this. And this was a deal that bailed out the Cuban regime there, they were under a lot of pressure. And maybe we could have had a less evil, a less repressive regime in Cuba if the Castros had fallen. But it took the pressure off them. And you see plenty more low-profile negotiations going on under Pope Francis. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the People's Army, or the FARC terrorist group, the FARC, he helped negotiate there and bring about a peace deal in Cuba. He made peace with the Chinese Communist Party, or compromise with the Chinese Communist Party, where before the Roman Catholic Church had been fairly antagonistic to the CCP, with Catholics in China split between a group loyal to Rome and a group that was kind of the more Chinese communist approved version of the Catholic Church. And he ended that and brought the Catholic Church much closer to China. He also brought the church closer to Russia, cultivating a good relationship with Vladimir Putin, much to the intense frustration of Catholic Ukrainian bishops who wanted him to take a very different line there. So he cemented the Catholic Church's role as a peacemaker, and there's a whole number of much smaller, lower-level conflicts that him and his Secretary of State, Pedro Parolin, were negotiating and dealing with. But also notice that all of these deals, again, work in one direction. They tend to favor U.S. enemies. They empowered China, dealing with Russia, Cuba throwing a lifeline to an evil, repressive regime at a place that is a crucial to America's geography, an island poised to cut off U.S. trade. And Mr. Flurry had a Key of David where he talked about the deadly dangerous Cuba deal. This is what he had to say about it. It's clip 1.
The U.S. has made a deal with Cuba, and they're trying to normalize relations there with Cuba. But I think both political parties don't realize how dangerous, and I mean extremely dangerous, this deal with Cuba really is, and the potential it has for disaster. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that history, but first I want to give you a scripture where God warns us about the potential of nuclear warfare, and something we need to look at very closely in Bible prophecy from an end-time book of Ezekiel. Notice Ezekiel 33 and verse 7. So you, O son of man, I have set you a watchman into the house of Israel. Therefore shall you hear the word at my mouth and warn them from me. Warn them from me. Now this is to the house of Israel. And the watchman is going to the house of Israel in this end time. And if you don't know who Israel is, well, our book on the United States and Britain and prophecy will explain that to you, and all of our literature is free. But what is the warning? What is the warning that God gives us? Well, he asked one of the most gigantic questions you'll ever ask anybody. Notice verse 11. Say unto them, as I live, says the eternal God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn you from your evil ways, for why will you die, O house of Israel? See, God wants us to turn. He doesn't want us to die or be conquered or destroyed by nuclear war or any other way. Our end time booklet on Ezekiel will explain all of that to you in detail. But God says terrible things will happen if we don't heed His warning. And He will always warn the house of Israel. But the watchman has to send out the warning. And is it certainly unreasonable to think that God would warn when we are literally proliferating nuclear weapons all over the world? And terrorists are soon going to get control of them as well. And what does that mean? Well, the subject here is God does give us hope and shows us how we can escape that and how we can avoid that. He tells us we have to turn. He uses that word 3 times in one verse. Here is what Reuters wrote about secret talks in Vatican City led to Cuban breakthrough. I just want to read a few words here from this article from December the 17th. It says the Vatican played a key role in the reapproachment, that is, that deal made with Cuba. In early summer 2014, Pope Francis, who is from Argentina, sent separate personal letters to Obama and Castro, urging them to exchange captives and improve relations. When the Pope received the U.S. President in Vatican City in late March, the secret Cuban talks were a central topic of discussion. Cuba, quote, got as much attention as anything else, the official said. Then the article concludes the Vatican got involved as early as March 2012 when a group of U.S. lawmakers went to the papal ambassador's office in Washington's posh Embassy Row section and pleaded for help. Since then, through a Vatican transition from Pope Benedict XVI, the preceding pope, to Pope Francis, it has always stayed on the Vatican's radar. And said Senator Barbara Mikulski from Gross's home state of Maryland. So there is a German connection here because there is a German pope involved. And of course, we know Germany is the economic power in Europe today, and there is going to be a Holy Roman Empire burst on the world scene at any time. And they're already talking about it, even in the newspapers and on television. They're discussing that more and more all the time, and we've been discussing it for some 70 years. Because it is prophesied in the Bible, and it is prophesied to come on the scene at this time. Now, could a European power be interested in Cuba? After all, Fidel Castro is about to die, and his brother Raul is ruling over Cuba, and he is getting quite old himself. So there could be a huge change in Cuba and in politics there, depending on what happens after the Castros are gone. And maybe Europe understands that and wants to, well, get something going in Cuba for some reason or the other.
But perhaps the biggest way that the Pope has sought to be involved in peacemaking brings me to my 4th point, and that is he worked to turn Christians against the state of Israel. Now, it's not like there was no irrational hatred of the Jews prior to Pope Francis, or any irrational hatred of the state of Israel, the Jewish state in the Middle East. That was there long before Pope Francis came along. But he really has worked hard to mainstream the idea that the Jews are the bad guys. And I think he's had a massive impact internationally on the push for a recognition of a Palestinian state and trying to tilt the international situation in favor of the Palestinians. He has really played up this narrative of the Palestinians are victims being forced to lash out by cruel Israelis, something that has no basis in the truth, but has become very widely believed. So in May 2014, the Pope visited Jerusalem, but he didn't fly straight to Israel. Instead, he flew to Jordan on May 24th, and he spent a lot of the next day inside the Palestinian territories. He visited the Palestinians first. And looking back on this visit from 10 years, there is one photograph that newspapers will illustrate this visit with. And that was where he prayed at Israel's border wall. And this was designed to be an eye-catching photo op. And it worked. And look, we've seen the essential nature of a border wall on October 7th. What happens when Israel doesn't have a barrier to stop terrorists pouring into its country? They kidnap women and children, murder babies. It would be great if there was no border wall. The way to not have a border wall is to have Palestinians stop their irrational hatred of Jews and these attacks. But that's not what Pope Francis focused on. He wanted to have a photo op that made the border wall look like a tool of suppression. Again, to fuel this narrative that Palestinians are victims and that Israelis are oppressors. And so he condemned that wall. He was praying there next to some graffiti that says "Free Palestine." During a Sunday Mass on his trip, he prayed with a Palestinian archbishop, the Catholic Church's Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Fouad. And this archbishop gave a sermon in the Pope's presence where he talked about the Israelis being present-day version of Christ killers, or at least implied that by talking about Palestinians walking in the footsteps of baby Jesus and likening Israel to King Herod. He said, "We are not yet done with the present-day Herods who fear peace more than war and who are prepared to continue killing." That was from what this Latin patriarch said. That's the implication that the Jews are like Herod that tried to kill the 2-year-old baby Jesus. And the Pope didn't push back on that. Instead, he kind of built off themes that this archbishop used during his sermon. On top of that, he embraced the Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem, Sheikh Mohammed Hussein, and he called the Mufti dear friend. Well, actually, his note said that he should call him dear friends. He called them dear brothers. He embraced this man as a brother. Just 2 years before this trip, Hussein has said it was the destiny of Muslims to kill Jews. He called Jews subhuman beasts, the enemy of Allah. He's praised suicide bombers. And Pope Francis called him a dear brother. I wouldn't shake hands with a man like that, let alone embrace him and call him dear brother. The next year, we saw more dramatic news from the Vatican. They announced that they had formally recognized the state of Palestine. They had a new treaty with the Palestinians, and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas visited the Vatican. And the Pope called him an angel of peace. And this man is a terrorist, and the Pope called him an angel of peace, almost giving papal approval to what some of these Palestinian Arabs are doing. And we're seeing this recognition of a state of Palestine gaining a lot of momentum right now. And France is holding a meeting where they've pledged to recognize Palestine, and they're trying to bring other people here. I mean, remember the role of the Pope in really mainstreaming this and encouraging more nations to do this. And then after October 7th, we've seen the Pope clearly side with Hamas and been called out by a lot of people for it. A lot of people have talked about the Pope's silence on what the Israelis experienced on October 7th, and then at the same time outspokenness and attacks on what Israel has done in response to that. The day after the massacre, he expressed sorrow over what is happening in Israel and said every war is a defeat. He didn't condemn Hamas in that statement. 3 days later, he briefly recognized the right of those who were attacked to defend themselves, but then spent most of his time talking about, quote, the total siege facing Palestinians in Gaza, where there have also been many innocent victims. In 2024, he said what happened in Gaza has the characteristics of a genocide. It should be carefully investigated. Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry wrote, the Pope did worse than try to make the blood-soaked terrorists and the Israeli people equally guilty. He made the Israelis look much more guilty. Just in December, Pope Francis unveiled a nativity scene with a picture of a baby, supposedly baby Jesus, lying in a manger with a Palestinian kiefer. Quite clearly taking a side here. And again, continuing this same libel that was there in his visit to Jerusalem 10 years ago. Well, the Jews are Herod, killing baby Jesus, and the Palestinians, well, they're innocent here. And on December 7th, Francis himself unveiled this nativity scene. In the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, they wrote, 80 years after the Holocaust, the silence of a pope is straining the relationship between Israel and the Vatican. And that pope is not called Pius XII. His name is Francis. Since the Hamas attack on Israel, the head of the Catholic Church has consistently avoided making a clear distinction between aggressor and victim. Instead, the Pope makes sweeping denunciations of terrorism in the Middle East conflict, apparently referring primarily to the Israeli side. Francis allowed the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, the highest Catholic representative in Israel, to sign a statement from Christian churches unchallenged, which unilaterally blames Israel for the escalation of the conflict. And the Pope has continued this right up to the end of his life, even while sick in hospital. He was making daily calls to a priest in Gaza. And you look at what both sides have said about this discussion, there was no call on Catholics there to, well, examine themselves and see if they'd allowed the hatred of Gazans around them to rub off on them, and calling for them to have a loving foot-washing attitude towards their Jewish neighbors and to make sure they hadn't imbibed the hate that just is so common there in Gaza. But instead, it was all just the Pope saying, well, I am with you, and those kind of statements. Yet despite all this, people look to the Roman Catholic Church still as a peacemaker in the Middle East, and we can expect its role to grow. But all of these legacies of Pope Francis are right in line with Bible prophecy. We already read that quote from Mr. Armstrong that he said in 1984 about a massive banking crisis in America triggering Europe to unite. Bible prophecy forecasts a new financial system that's not centered on the United States, but in Europe. And Herbert W. Armstrong's free book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy, it shows the US is descended from biblical Israel. And Israel has received massive blessings from God, not because they've earned them or deserved them, but because God made these promises to Abraham. And now, because of our sins, God is removing those blessings and correcting us. And that applies to Britain and America, who are both descended from Israel. And so the financial system, the massive prosperity that goes with dominating the financial system, that is being taken away from the US. The way that it was taken away from Britain, that used to kind of be the global dominant financial power. And it is being given now to that power rising up in Europe. And Revelation 17 and Revelation 18 describe this. Revelation 17 talks about, quote, the great whore that sits upon many waters. That's in verse 1. With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of fornication. A woman is a church in Bible prophecy. Ephesians 5 talks about the bride of Christ. But this great whore is clearly a counterfeit. A church that is a prostitute, not the bride of Christ. A church that has dealings with the kings of the earth. Verse 6 says that she is guilty of killing true Christians. There is only one church that matches this description. And even many commentaries, just from people out in the world, can see this, that Revelation 17 is talking about the Catholic Church. And Revelation 18 is talking about this same modern Babylon system dominated, led by the Catholic Church. And it talks about it as a massive commercial hub where merchants are made rich. And the Holy Roman Empire, led by the Catholic Church, dominates this new global financial system. And Pope Francis has done a lot. He's paved the way for that to happen. And I think he's articulated a moral case that you will see continue to be articulated. That the Catholic Church needs to have a role in the replacement of the American-dominated financial system. And that what we have right now is intrinsically unjust. And we're going to see a push for a European alternative, but we're going to see a push for the Catholic Church to have a big role in that. We're also seeing, again, this church that wields major political power. You know, that's something I've said that's always been there. Revelation 17 and verse 2 says the kings of the earth have committed fornication with this church, with this woman. She's always wielded political power, but they're going to continue to do that as well. This is something Herbert W. Armstrong described. He wrote about this. This is a quote from his 1951 Plain Truth article titled, "The Pope Plans to Move the Vatican." and under the subhead, The Great Unrecognized Dictatorship, he wrote, "How many have realized these staggering facts? The oldest political dictatorship on the earth is the Vatican. The Roman Catholic Church is far more than a religion. It is also politically a world power." He went on to say, "And how many people know that the real objective of the Catholic political power is precisely the same as the goals of communism and fascism, to gain dominance, control, and rule over the whole world?" I mean, look at the Pope's calls for a global political authority. That's right in line with what Mr. Armstrong is writing here. Again, further down, he says, "Of course, it is generally known that most nations send ambassadors to the Vatican, and papal ambassadors are established in most world capitals. You're going to see that with the Pope's funeral already. We're seeing the guest lists and who's going and who's not. It looks like Prince William is going from the UK. President Trump seems like he's going to go. Vladimir Putin won't. But we're getting all of those details now." But going back to this article, Mr. Armstrong says, "But it has not generally been grasped that this Roman system is much more than a church. It is a state, called in the Encyclopedia Britannica an ecclesiastical world empire. It is a political dictatorship. It is a world power whose influences in many respects outweighs that of any nation on earth." And he continues, "I'm not here saying anything about or against Catholic people, either in the United States or elsewhere, nor am I saying anything about the Catholic religion, save that it is pagan, cloaking the original Chaldean mysteries in the garb of Christianity, falsely so labeled, and deceiving its own adherents, who are quite often sincere and devout, with its sense-appealing pomp, ceremony, mysticism, and superstition. But what I am here concerned with is a Catholic political power. The papacy is a world power, a dictatorship bent on conquering and ruling the world." Mr. Flurry has talked about the Catholic Church as a political power as well. Here's a clip from one of his Key of David programs back in the 90s.
That's very important that we understand that. Now, I think it's important that we look a little closer at the Vatican and what they did in World War II, because it does relate to that Holy Roman Empire that I'm talking to you about. The Vatican is certainly has a great influence in this world, and the Pope, I am sure, would be the most popular religious figure in the world. And he really has three crowns. One is he rules over people spiritually, like 1 billion people around the world, roughly that. He's also the Bishop of Rome, and he rules over this great administrative work of the priests and the nuns and the laymen and the like. But also he has another crown that is more interesting, and that is he is a sovereign head of state, and he's considered equal to prime ministers, presidents. And so I think a man of that stature certainly should be held somewhat more accountable.
And as Mr. Flurry said there, that history even with World War II is important to be familiar with. But the Catholic Church is a peacemaker. This is also something that is very directly prophesied. There's so much that we could go into here. And Daniel chapter 8 talks about the rise of the same power that's described in Revelation 17. And talking about the secular leader of that rising beast power, Daniel chapter 8 and verse 25 says that by peace he shall destroy many. This power, this European power, is looked at as a peace broker. And the Catholic Church is going to play a major role in that. You see this also in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11 and verse 40 tells us it's talking about the time of the end, and it's describing this clash between this Catholic-dominated European power and this Islamist king of the south. And verse 41 says that this king of the north shall enter also into the glorious land. He enters into what's now the state of Israel in the Middle East. And the Hebrew there implies peaceful entry. They're invited in as peacekeepers, and you can put this side by side with a whole number of other scriptures that show that this is a peaceful entry. Verse 24 even of Daniel 11 says, he shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province. And that is again a passage talking about the secular leader soon to come of this beast power. But they're invited in as peacemakers. Their role, the Catholic Church and this European powers continue to be looked at as a peacemaker in Israel and around the world. Verse 45 says, though, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas, in the glorious holy mountain, Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. He sets up his headquarters in Jerusalem. Clearly, this church and this religious leader here has his own designs on Jerusalem and sets up his headquarters there. And you see this in Pope Francis's approach. And the Vatican has also been consistent of having its own agenda and its own goals for the Middle East. They want control over the Temple Mount, and they want control over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the old city of Jerusalem, and they're going to get it. And they're going to move their headquarters for there. So there's great significant steps that we've had from Pope Francis moving Bible prophecy forwards. But what now remains? What is next? In what ways are we expecting a new pope to be different? We'll take a quick break, and then we'll look at what the Bible prophesies for the next pope. Welcome back to Trumpet World. Our latest Trumpet print edition has an article from Editor-in-Chief Gerald Flurry titled, "A New Era Requires a New Pope," laying out why, based on Bible prophecy, we expected there to be a new pope. And of course, this was written before Pope Francis died, but back while he was ill. I think it's very fitting and inspired that it's arriving in mailboxes right now. But in that article, Mr. Flurry explains, a new era in world history has begun. Jesus Christ prophesied of this period called the times of the Gentiles, Luke 21:24. We have to understand what this means. We are entering into the worst suffering in history. It will be extremely violent and thankfully short. It should not catch you off guard. And we talked about that in the first half, how that Britain and America are descended from Israel. God is now punishing these nations because of our disobedience. And so power is shifting away from Israel to non-Israel or to the Gentiles. And so we are entering into these times of the Gentiles. And Mr. Flurry talks about the way that the Bible prophecy has a lot to say about the role the Vatican will play in these times. In some ways, Pope Francis has prepared the Catholic Church to fulfill some of these prophecies, he said, and that's what we've talked about in the first half. However, I believe the changing time we live in will require a different pope. Pope Francis doesn't quite fit the picture. Prophecy tells us we should expect a strong leader to arise in Germany. Europe's most powerful country is facing many pressures right now. The war in Ukraine, significant conflict in the Middle East, and Lebanon and Syria, where Germany has vested interests. The possibility of more migrants flooding into Europe. And Germany's in a political mess. This nation needs much stronger leadership. Prophecy tells us it is about to get it. The Vatican will help bring that political leader on the scene, and that is when we will really see the fireworks. Prophecy says the Vatican will become very powerful and instigate radical changes. And Pope Francis wasn't really the man to make that happen. But Europe has desperately needed the Catholic Church if it's going to come together. This unification and the role that the Catholic Church would play in bringing a strong German leader to power is something Herbert W. Armstrong talked about for years. Here's a clip from a 1978 World Tomorrow program.
Now, a united Europe will bring about a power, a superpower, because the nations of Europe want to unite. They just don't know how to do it. And it's possible that the now present Pope may, or a future one, however it may be, extend his good offices to help them bring about what they would like to have in Europe. Not only economical cooperation, but an absolute political union with a common currency and a common military force. There is a great deal of nuclear power and weapons over there belonging to the United States, but which they could easily just take over. And they could become a stronger power than either the United States or Russia. And now within 2 decades, there's the promise that China may be greater than any of them. And one in competition against the others. That is the future that you can look forward to, and that is the world that you are living in now.
And Mr. Armstrong was basing this prophecy on Revelation 17. It says that you'd have a beast, a symbol of an empire in biblical prophecy, and this woman, this church, would ride it and steer it and direct it. This empire would be led by the Catholic Church. And the Revelation 17 talks about this beast. Well, we can turn there. It talks about this beast having 7 heads. And verse 10 explains what these are. It says, "And these are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space." So 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. These are 7 leaders of the Holy Roman Empire that come one after the other. They come consecutively. And this prophecy is frozen in time. In total, this empire will rise and fall 7 times, will have 7 heads, and God would have a man on the scene during that 6th head, that time when one is, who would explain what Revelation 17 meant, that God would reveal to him what Revelation 17 meant, and he would have a powerful message taking that to the world. And that's exactly what happened. Under Mr. Armstrong, he lived at the time when 5 are fallen and 1 is. That 1 being Adolf Hitler and Mussolini in Europe. And that's what he talks about in this next clip. This is from a 1984 sermon where Mr. Flurry explains a lot of this history.
The Roman Catholic Church will sit on top of this coming united Europe. She did in 554. She did in 800. She did in the 12th century. She did in the Habsburg dynasty. She did in the time of down to 1814. Napoleon. And Napoleon, when he was crowned, he snatched the crown right out of the Pope's hand as the Pope was going to crown him, and put it on his own head. And then Mussolini revived it as the 6th head of that beast, and the 7th one is coming up now in a united Europe, a reunification of Europe. I've talked to the leaders over in Athens, Greece. They want it so bad they can eat it. I've talked to the King of Spain, King Juan Carlos, and had a long talk with him in his office privately. And a very friendly one at that. But he's very anxious for this union to come and wants to be a part of it. And very strong for the Catholic Church. God says, I, God, was wroth with my people, that's our people, Israel. I have polluted mine inheritance and given them into thine hand. God is going to give us over to this united Europe. God gave us the wealth that we have. God blessed this country. We printed on their money, in God we trust, but we didn't trust in God. I mean the country didn't. When I say we, I'm talking the United States, not the church. I hope we do trust in God and the church, but the nation has not.
God is raising up this power, just like we've talked about. But watch this next pope. That fulfilled prophecy will point you back to Mr. Armstrong, and ultimately back to God that revealed all of this. But you'll note that in verse 3, it talks about this beast having 7 heads and 10 horns. So, okay, 7 heads, it rises and falls 7 times. But then verse 12 says, and the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which receive no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So these come right at the end, during the last head. You have 10 horns, and they reign together. They're not one after the other. And so these 10 horns would be dominated by one strong leader, but they reign together and they're led by the Catholic Church. And this is what Mr. Armstrong talked about so much, that you would need the Catholic Church to bring the 10 horns, to bring these 10 kings in Europe together. Here's a clip from a 1980 sermon where he talked about that.
Now that's what we're expecting next over here in Europe, is that there will be a union of 10 nations going together in Europe, and the Pope at Rome will sit on top of the whole heap. There will be one man over all of the governments. There will be a king, or I don't know, they may call him a president, a prime minister, or whatever term they give him, I don't know, over each one of the 10 nations.
So watch for this upcoming pope to have great stature within Europe, to help bring the strong man in Germany to power, to help Germany get their strong leader, and then to help get these 10 kings, 10 nations working together. And Mr. Armstrong talked often about how, well, Europe would not just roll over and submit to a strong German leader. France wouldn't just accept a German strongman, nor Italy, nor Spain. And Germany would certainly never accept a French strongman, etc. And instead, he pointed out, well, they need the Catholic Church to reconcile the rest to having this strong leader. And this is the role that the Catholic Church has played throughout history. It was the Catholic Church that anointed Charlemagne and brought his family to prominence and put them over, made them his line, the rulers of the Franks. And then Charlemagne protected the Catholic Church. And this is the model that Europe points back to all the time of being like Charlemagne. And it was this working relationship between church and state where both helped each other. And so Germany will need the Catholic Church to make this dominance by this German strongman palatable. And then maybe the Catholic Church will extract some concessions. Well, they'll certainly make sure that they're riding and steering the beast, but they may kind of play this mediator role between North and Southern Europe and getting this strongman in charge. Mr. Flurry in that article writes, most likely we will see a church leader installed on the papal throne who knows the German system and will help install the political leader who can really swing Europe around, a good, strong believer of the church's doctrines. And I think it's interesting that you're seeing a strong Catholic revival now, that people, as you get some backlash to woke, they want tradition. And they're going back to the Catholic Church, this church that does have 2,000 years of tradition. The Telegraph had an article, The Extraordinary Resurgence of the Catholic Faith in Britain. And it argued that actually, if you look at those who attend church services regularly, Britain has more Catholics than members of the Church of England. And where you've seen a lot of churches like the Church of England gone woke and compromised with woke ideology, the Catholic Church is much more loyal to tradition. Now, it's just that these traditions, in so many cases, don't come from the Bible, as our free book, Which Day is the Christian Sabbath, or Pagan Holidays, or God's Holy Days, which will show you. But they have centuries of their own tradition, and that gives people a sense of grounding, and it's something that they want in this modern age. And in this new era, you could see a pope that's more of a traditionalist and that gets Europe back to its roots, doing really well and really being in a great position to play the role of this unifier and bringing this Daniel 8 man, this strong German leader, to power. Something else Mr. Flurry focuses on this article is that the church is prophesied to bring back in its protesting daughters. Isaiah 47 talks about the daughter of Babylon. It's the same language as Revelation 17. It's talking about, as I read from Mr. Armstrong earlier, this Catholic Church that has the name of Christian, but brings in a whole lot of different Babylonian doctrines and ideas under this name. And this woman, again, it's represented as a woman here, Isaiah 47 verse 8. Therefore, hear now this, you that are given to pleasures, that dwell carelessly, that say in your heart, I am and none else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. And this Catholic Church tells itself, I'm not going to know the loss of children. It lost its protesting daughters, but it's got a plan to bring them back into the fold. And again, Mr. Flurry has talked about this for years. Here's another clip from him on that.
Now, I've written an article in our Trumpet that is coming out, and I'd like for you to be sure you get that and read it, because it will explain about all of this, these churches trying to get together and what it really means. What does it mean? What does it mean when all these churches are trying to get together? There is obviously very immense authority that the Catholic Church has, and now they're trying to get together. And why is it we have all this division? And they're struggling now to try to correct that.
They're working to bring in all of these different churches, and Pope Benedict did this a lot, creating the kind of the institutional setup for Anglicans to return to Rome while keeping a lot of their own distinctive traditions, like married priests. And that's something that could easily be expanded as a template to help bring in other Christians. And as long as they submit to the Pope, they can keep some of their own traditions. You've also seen, I think both Francis and Benedict did a lot to bring in the Orthodox religion. And so much of the schism and the disagreements between Catholics and Orthodox have basically been ended. So there's a lot happening there. But Mr. Flurry in this article notes, however, biblical prophecy indicates that full unity will not be achieved voluntarily. At some point, the Mother Church will abandon its efforts to woo her daughters back by flatteries, and instead revert to the age-old method of enforcing Christian unity through physical force. That too will likely require a different pope. That's not a kind of Francis way of doing things. And I think another way you can expect a different pope is expect the pope to rally Europe against the Middle East. And this is something that comes right from Daniel 11 and that clash between a Catholic king of the north and an Islamist king of the south that we talked about earlier. That's something else that Mr. Flurry has talked about for years. Here's what he talked about going back to some statements that Pope Benedict made. This is, I think, a 2015 Key of David, clip 2.
Out of all of this, you can see the Holy Roman Empire rising up along with the king of the south. And it's more noticeable, and it's going to get more and more noticeable as time goes on. But let me read you something that I wrote in November, December 2006, Trumpet, our magazine. That's over 8 years ago. In September, Pope Benedict XVI made some comments in Germany that confronted the issue of Islam and its violent tendencies. So he's talking about radical Islam. Even then, the Pope that preceded the one presently in office. The article goes on to say, when Muslims responded by becoming violent, many prominent Europeans got behind the Pope in support of what he said. When the Pope begins to confront Islamists, the world should be alarmed. The Vatican knows its next great adversary is Islamism, that is the radical type of Islam. Now look, if you think about it, Germany and Rome are the heart of the Holy Roman Empire and most all of those resurrections of the past, the 6 resurrections of the past, and it will be the same in the 7th one that is now exploding on the world scene.
So rather than cozying up to Muslim migrants, we're expecting a pope that will rally Europe to fight radical Islam and rediscover its roots in opposition to Islam. So we're looking for a Europe that stands up for itself, that confronts Islam, and you need a new pope to do that. In the Eternal has chosen Jerusalem, Mr. Flurry writes, the Jews have Jerusalem now, but not for long. Both Muslims and Catholics have long cherished designs for this city. These two powers are about to clash again in the final crusade over Jerusalem. So we'll see this on the international scene. We'll see them deal with Muslim migration that is causing real problems. I'm not criticizing dealing with the migration crisis at all, but we're going to see a pope that stands up to that migration crisis and then takes it a whole lot further and ultimately really enforces one branch of Christianity on all of Europe. And then that even gets into the mark of the beast being enforced on all of Europe, a distinctive mark of the Catholic Church. And a mark that ultimately all of its protesting daughters have accepted. That mark of Sunday observance. And that's something Herbert W. Armstrong proves in his book, Who or What is the Prophetic Beast? Part 2 of that proves exactly what is meant by the mark of the beast. So this soon-coming leader, he's going to unify Europe. He'll unify the Catholic Church. He'll bring in protesting daughters. And Mr. Armstrong often connected the two, kind of the unifying the Catholic Church and unifying Europe. That while bringing in the Eastern Orthodox, bringing in the Protestants, that's going to help the church in its role of unifying Europe. You've got a lot of Eastern Orthodox Christians in Southeastern Europe. You've got a lot of Protestantism in Germany. So a Roman Catholic Church that unifies with all of these has a lot more clout at Europe. But then we're going to see a Catholic Church that plays a major role in gearing Europe for war. And we have so much fulfilled prophecy on the Catholic Church already. It points to the great God who revealed it all. And our free book, The Holy Roman Empire in Prophecy, has a lot more to say about this church and about fulfilled prophecy. It will take you through each of the 7 heads of the Holy Roman Empire and show how prophecy has already been fulfilled with so many of them. Even this 7th head, we've seen so much be fulfilled. But more importantly, it shows you why. Why has God allowed the biggest church in the world to be so deceived? Why is God only working through a little flock, in Christ's own words, not a great big church with billions of adherents? What is God doing with the Catholic Church? Well, God loves everyone and has a plan to reach everyone. Right now, the world is deceived. Satan is the god of this world. But we're very close to the end of this world and the end of this worldwide deceit. And our free book, The Holy Roman Empire in Prophecy, will show you how this all fits in with God's master plan and with Bible prophecy. And you can get that on our website, thetrumpet.com. As with all of our material, we're very happy to send that out to you for free. You can just read it online. You can order your own free print copy there. Just click on the literature tab at the top right-hand corner. If you have any questions, any comments, want to get in touch with the show, you can email us at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. That is about all we have time for today. Thank you so much to George Haddad for engineering and production. Barring no other big surprises, we will publish our Brussels special that we just recorded a few days ago. Next Wednesday, we'll be back for our week in review session on Friday. And until then, keep watching your world.